This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, a series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. In today's video, we'll be looking at an old mechanic, Threshold. It appeared almost exclusively in Odyssey block, but it was a pretty pushed mechanic there, and as a result there are 85 cards that feature the mechanic, which is quite a lot for one that hasn't appeared on very many cards over the last 20 years or so. If a card has Threshold, it means that if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, the card gains some kind of bonus or alternate ability. In the end, it proved to be a little too easy to meet that requirement, and that's the main reason we've only seen it appear on a single card since Odyssey block. It's a little bit too good. In fact, when I did my MTG Top 10 on the mechanics that were the most dominant in multiple competitive formats, Threshold came in at number 7. So, as I said, there are 85 cards that were eligible for this list, and in this video, we'll look at the 10 that have been the most successful at Magic's highest level of competition. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, or Mythic Invitational Top 8 is worth 2 points, as are Legacy or Vintage Championship Top 8s, and a Magic Festa Grand Prix Top 8 is worth 1 point. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it is Centaur Garden. Odyssey has a whole cycle of lands with Threshold, and obviously enough, Centaur Garden is the green card from that cycle. These lands can all tap for colored mana right away, but you have to lose 1 life when you produce that mana. If that's all this was, obviously it would just be a worse forest, but by adding Threshold to these lands, they gain some serious later game upside. The garden suddenly becomes a land that can giant growth one of your creatures, and that's no joke. It makes combat challenging for your opponent when you reach that point, since even just the threat of activation can result in a blowout. In block, the garden was played in Blue-Green Threshold and Madness decks. Blue-Green Madness was also a successful deck in Standard. It also has 1 Pro Tour Top 8 from Extended, where it was played in a Sultai Madness Psychotog deck. Threshold pairs pretty well with Madness, since Madness wants you to discard cards, while Threshold wants cards in the graveyard. We'll see several cards on this list that have points in decks that feature both mechanics. At number 9, it is Fledgling Dragon. It starts out as a 4-mana 2/2 with flying, which is not pretty, but when you get Threshold going, it becomes a 4-mana Shivan Dragon, having the exact same stats and fire-breathing ability, and that's pretty fun flavor-wise. And 4 mana for a Shivan Dragon is a pretty amazing deal. It was played in mono-red aggro decks and Extended, and it also has a single point that came in a Legacy Threshold deck. It hasn't been played anywhere since 2005, but given that we never see cards with Threshold these days, it would take an old card suddenly seeing lots of play for Fledgling Dragon to ever fall down this list. At number 8, it is Rancid Earth. It has 10 points, just like Fledgling Dragon, but I gave it the edge because it has more Pro Tour Top 8s. Anyway, it's just a typical 3-mana land destruction spell without Threshold, but if you can get it going, it also does 1 damage to everything, something that's pretty powerful in the right metagame. Odyssey block constructed was one of those metagames. In that format, it could kill heavily played creatures like Nantuko Shade and Basking Rootwalla. In block, Rancid Earth gained most of its points in mono-black control decks. It also has a single standard Pro Tour Top 8, where it was played in Psychotog. It is worth noting too that Rancid Earth is played a fair bit in Pauper, as there just aren't very many cards at the common rarity that can do 1 damage to the whole board like this. At number 7, it is Mystic Enforcer. Kind of like Fledgling Dragon, it starts out pretty inefficiently as a 4-mana 3/3, but it has a Threshold ability that turns it into a 6/6 flyer, something that can really end a game in a hurry, especially because it generally had immunity from whatever the best removal spell was in most formats, thanks to protection from black. As is the case for pretty much all the cards on this list, most of the decks that ran it were especially good at quickly getting Threshold, including some decks built entirely around the mechanic. Mystic Enforcer gained points in Threshold decks in Standard, Legacy, and Extended. Mystic Enforcer didn't see play in block its first time through, but it received a time-shifted reprint in Time Spiral, granting it a second run through both block and Standard, and it took advantage, being played in Green, White, and Naya aggro decks. However, it didn't gain any points in Standard as a result of the reprint, and it doesn't have any points since gaining a few in Time Spiral block constructed back in 2007. At number 6, it is Barbarian Ring, which is part of the same cycle as Centaur Garden. Like the Garden, it hurts you when you tap it for mana, but the threshold upside is great. In this case, once you fulfill it, you can turn your Barbarian Ring into Shock, and that's a pretty real effect to get out of a land. If you can kill a creature with it or do lethal damage to your opponent, you're getting some very serious value out of it, and the damage it does to you until then is well worth it. The ring didn't see much play in block or standard, but it was played in a ton of extended decks, primarily in goblins and red deck wins, both decks that sought to end the game quickly and loved being able to get 2 damage out of one of their lands. It's also been played in legacy burn decks as well as in lands, a deck that is loaded up with a bunch of lands, as the name suggests. That deck can tutor up lands when they're at their most useful, and grabbing a Barbarian Ring at the right time is pretty powerful. It's also played in Vintage Dredge. At number 5, it is Werebear. It starts out as a 2-mana 1/1 that can tap for green mana. 2 mana for a 1/1 is a terrible rate, even if it does tap for mana, but obviously Werebear gets a huge boost once you reach Threshold, becoming a 2 mana 4/4. I think the design on this card is actually pretty cool, mostly because it's very flavorful, with the idea being that while it is a 2 mana 1/1, it's a normal human druid, but Threshold causes him to transform into a much scarier human bear druid. This card came way before double-faced cards, and while I like double-faced cards more for conveying creatures who transform like this was a good attempt at it at the time. Anyhow, Werebear was played in Madness decks in block, and in Threshold decks in Extended and Legacy. In Extended, it was played in Super Grow, an aggro control deck that loved that this could help you ramp, and then turn into a win condition in the late game without having to put any additional mana into the card. At number 4, it is Putrid Imp. A 1 mana 1/1 is usually unplayable, but of course, this little imp has a lot more going on than that. Its ability to gain flying by discarding cards is nice, especially because it means you can put cards into your graveyard that you want there. Then, of course, it becomes a 1 mana 2/2 when you get Threshold going. Its first points came in an Extended Reanimator deck in 2004, but then it went quiet for 4 whole years. Then the imp helped power the very first Dredge deck ever, which emerged and Extended in 2008. This version of Dredge was largely built around Ichorid. The imp could help you get Ichorid into the graveyard, and it could also make sure your Ichorid has the necessary fuel to come back, while also chipping in for damage. It's also seen regular play in Legacy Dredge and Reanimator decks since 2010. Putrid Imp is still pretty active, and it's likely that it's going to continue to gain points. At number 3, it is Cephalid Colosseum. It's the third and final card from the Threshold land cycle to make this list. Like the others, the fact it comes into play untapped and can tap for mana right away, even if you have to lose life, is nice, especially because it has this great Threshold upside. In this case, you can draw 3 cards and discard 3 cards, and that's some serious card selection. And in most of the decks that played the Colosseum, discarding the cards wasn't even really a downside. Instead, it enabled the deck in various ways by putting things in the graveyard that you wanted there. In Standard and Extended, it was played in Psychotog control decks, which sought to win the game with the eponymous creature who happened to really like feasting on cards in the graveyard. It was also played in Extended Ichorid Dredge decks alongside Putrid Imp. It's also been played in Legacy Dredge decks, and in general, the Colosseum is great in Dredge because it gives you a draw trigger to dredge with, and it can help you load up your graveyard with other cards with Dredge that might be in your hand. Cephalid Colosseum is likely not done putting up points just yet. At number 2, it is Cabal Ritual. It starts out as a worse version of Dark Ritual, but once you have Threshold, it gives you 5 mana for 2. It didn't see any play in block or standard. These type of effects often don't, because going down a card to ramp a little bit isn't normally worth it. However, like all ritual effects, Cabal Ritual is going to be at its best in Storm decks, which seek to play a bunch of cards in a single turn, and then win the game with something like Tendrils of Agony. This kind of effect is great for that, since it adds to your Storm count while giving you more mana to play more ritual and card draw effects until you chain together the necessary number of spells to kill your opponent. Storm decks also get around the problem of going down a card, because they plan on just winning the game once they start going off, in which case, it doesn't really matter that they're going down cards to produce mana. It's been played in Storm decks in Extended, Legacy, and Vintage, and that's probably going to continue to be the case. And at number 1, it's Nimble Mongoose. While the 1 mana 1/1 with Shroud is nothing too special, the Mongoose becomes a 1 mana 3/3 with Shroud when you gain Threshold, and as we have said, getting Threshold is pretty darn easy in some formats, and the Mongoose is arguably the best non-mana dork green 1-drop in this entire game. This has resulted in the Mongoose being an excellent card, especially in Legacy, where it's been fairly prolific. Legacy has a deck completely built around Threshold, usually called Canadian Threshold. In addition to that, the Mongoose is also played in some Delver decks in Legacy. The Mongoose doesn't have any points since 2018, and there are fewer Legacy events being held these days, but it is fairly likely that it will gain points in the format again at some point. However, I think there's a very real chance that Cabal Ritual will pass it one day. Well, those are the 10 best cards with Threshold, ranked by their historical performance of Magic's highest level of competition. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you do that, it makes it more likely other people will find and enjoy this video. If you want to make sure you're aware of new MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the more than 310 MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.